Hello, I'm joined by Peter Nelson, an environmental scientist, land use planner, and substantial development consultant who has spent 25 years working in Africa, Europe, and Asia. He holds degrees in geography, environmental conservation, and town and regional planning, and has worked on a wide range of issues relating to climate change, biodiversity loss, poverty, water scarcity, forestry, mining, and human development. His most recent venture is a book titled Strategic Environmental Assessment that examines the global challenges posed by biodiversity loss, climate change, water shortages, poverty, poor health, food insecurity, and a lack of education, racial and ethnic conflicts, and the impacts of new technologies. Wow, that was a mouthful. A very long introduction. Peter, you have a lot going on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you also, Alison. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the book.
I have a list of questions for you, so we can just dive right in and start with the first question. I would like to begin by asking a little about your background. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, you very neatly summarized quite a lot of it. I spent about 20 years working in Europe. I then found myself out in South Africa. From there, I had the opportunity to work in more than 14 countries internationally. All of those studies have been focused on either regional or national scale problems. It might be in water, minerals, mining, forestry, in all these range of issues. And I've always worked with local teams, and I want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm saying comes on the experience of those local consultants in all those countries. I then found myself caught out by lockdown during the coronavirus, the fact that I could no longer travel out to the different countries I was working in. And I was sitting at home wondering what on earth I was going to do with my time. So that basically brings us up to date. That's where we are right now.
I'm just curious, where are you located right now? Where's home?
Okay, I'm sitting in Bristol in the United Kingdom. It's actually heading up, of course, as we know, to Christmas, but it's pretty wet and windy outside at the moment. I'd much prefer to be out there in Africa.
I just got back from Germany a couple days ago, and it was definitely colder than I'm used to here in Florida, but as long as you're dressed appropriately for the weather, it's beautiful.
I actually spent some time in Florida myself, going back to 1969, when I was looking at water resource conservation. And so the whole story of Okeechobee and the Everglades is something that I was fascinated by.
We could go on about that in a whole other interview. There are so many issues with Florida's water system, and I would love to chat with you about that. But in the meantime, we're here to talk about your book. So I'm curious to know what prompted you to write a book.
Well, I suppose after a career that's actually spans 50 years, it's quite remarkable, but that's how long I've been working on the environmental field. I thought I ought to try and capture some of my experiences over that time. And I was going to try and write about individual projects, but then I realized that was going to be pretty boring. I mean, the book itself may be pretty boring. It's pretty dense, because what I decided I would do was try and draw on that collective experience and look at some of the challenges that we're facing as a species. And of course, what we all focus on at the moment, we've just had the COP28 summit on climate change. And wherever you live in the world, you are experiencing the consequences of global warming. But the knock-on effect is that the wildlife, the animal populations have also been suffering enormously. You only have to look at what happened in Australia a year ago with the devastation from bushfires. And I thought, well, I ought to try and see if I could use some of the skills I'd learned to pull all of these issues together. What I realized was that I'm not the first to try it by any means. If we go back, we can look at Gro Brundtland's report, the Commission on Sustainable Development, back in 1980. Even before that, there was the Meadows study on limits to growth, the Club of Rome, bringing us up to date with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. Many, many exercises have looked at the issues, but they tended to focus on the key issue of climate change. And I had no preconceived idea where my efforts would take me, but the more I got into the study process, the more I realized that just about every organization has done its own analysis, whether you're talking about the United Nations organizations, or some of the major conservation bodies, the NGOs, they've all done an enormous amount of analysis, but there's no overall synthesis. And that's what I thought I'd try and tackle. And it's an absolute mammoth task. And it ends up with a book which covers 26 chapters. There's one dealing with each of the major issues that are linked to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. And well, I'm almost cutting to the end of the story, but what I realized is that basically human beings are split into two groups. There are the pessimists who believe that we're doomed, and there are the optimists who think that no matter what happens, we'll find a way of engineering our way out of the problems. So my whole analysis draws to a set of conclusions where I look at the way that human beings interact, how we communicate with each other, and how we try and reach key decisions. I only have to say, I don't know when this particular broadcast will go out, but right now we're waiting for a conclusion after 3 days from the Security Council of the UN over the issues which are taking place in the Middle East at the present time. And it demonstrates just how incredibly difficult it is for our societies to actually reach consensus on a lot of the key issues. So that's a fundamental conclusion, and it leads to some pretty radical recommendations.
It's funny you say that. I think that there can be a general truth. You could take any fact, but if one country supports it, then their adversary is going to go against that. And we see that a lot in politics. There really should only be one right answer, especially when it comes to science. But you have people see their opponent support something, and so then they have to be against it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think one of the processes I've been through is to look at where human species actually sits in the environment. And a lot of people grapple with the idea of geological timescale. It's something I've worked with for a long time, and I have no problem at all in saying that human beings, or at least our ancestors, first walked the land about 6 million years ago. But in practice, even if we look at the time of the birth of Christ 2,000 years ago, there were only 15 million people on this planet. That's about the size of Miami. I mean, the number of people actually living on the planet is, at that time, 2,000 years ago, was minor. When I was born, that's 1946, there were 3.4 billion people. That's an enormous number of people, all of whom need to be fed. But the remarkable thing for me is that that population of the globe has doubled in my lifetime. We are now approaching 8 billion people. That's almost 4.5 billion additional mouths to feed, additional water supply, energy, transport, everything that we're talking about. And it's put enormous strains on the planet. It's not simply about the emissions to air, it's about emissions to water, it's about use of land. So if we go back 10,000 years, when effectively human beings were learning to talk and walk and communicate with each other, we occupied about 4% of the available land on the planet. Now it's well over 50%. And the net result is, of course, that we've condensed areas of wildlife to basically to nature reserves and to national parks. And that rate of change is accelerating. And the problem with that is that if we actually look at where population growth is going to take place, there's no disagreement about any of what I'm talking about. There are about the very long-term prospects. Many people say the global population will shrink after 2100. But what is absolutely agreed is that between now and 2050, we will see another billion people on the planet. And by 2100, we will see 2 billion. And the interesting thing is that that growth is taking place in sub-Saharan Africa above anywhere else. Whereas in Europe, in China, in Asia, in Russia, populations are actually in decline. And the consequence of that for the global economy is going to be staggering. And part of the message in my book is we need to start talking about some of these issues because we are literally talking about a period of 50 years. There's no dispute.
Wow.
The existing growth is going to take place in that timescale. Now, talking about population is a very challenging issue because many people think that it shouldn't be part of our agenda politically or in any other way. People have very strong religious beliefs about it. I'm not making any judgment at all over the issue. I'm simply saying that what we will see is the major economies in the world are going to decline, and they're going to decline because they have aging population, they have fewer workers, and they're running increasingly into significant economic problems. Conversely, we have a very young population, particularly in Africa, rapidly expanding, no work, no jobs for the youth, and as we've seen recently in Africa, the scope for enormous tension on social and political grounds between people who have different beliefs as to how we get out of it. So the book is basically painting quite a challenging picture for the next 50 years, and by arguing that these are debates that are not taking place. We focus in the news week by week on whatever the current issue is. At the moment, we are desperately concerned about the conditions between Israel and Palestine without saying any of the detail. 2 months ago, we were feeling equally concerned about the balance between Ukraine and Russia. But what I saw last night on the news was that in both cases, the scale of the conflict is dwarfed by what is happening in Sudan. And here in Europe, that issue is not reported on at all. So the book is saying, if we're serious about dealing with these global problems, we've got to have a new way of working. Sorry, I've gone on a French there, Alison.
This is fascinating. There's so many opinions on the topic, and I find it really interesting to hear everybody's opinion. And you're all very well researched and experts on the topic. And you hear some people say, as you mentioned, some people are pessimistic, we're doomed. Other people are more optimistic. More people could bring more opportunities. All it takes is one person to solve the problem and perhaps figure out how can we efficiently create more food or create more land for wildlife. I mean, there's there's possibilities that can happen with bringing more people into the world, but there also can be problems. So this is a fascinating conversation. So in the book, are the ideas expressed based on your own ideas?
Inevitably, when you do any form of environmental study, we always like as professionals to say it's totally objective, it's totally scientifically based. But everybody has an opinion, and it's very difficult not to allow your own opinion to emerge in the course of 280 pages. But having said that, all of my source material is taken from published reports from bodies like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, IMF, WWF, that's the Wildlife Fund for Nature, Oxfam. All of these different bodies have published very well researched and authoritative reports. I've simply drawn those together into each chapter. I guess the way that I have woven the story does reflect some of these issues. I mean, it's based on the idea that you look first at the physical environment. That's the world we inhabit, whether it's in a good condition or a bad condition. We then have to look at the social conditions. And again, those are all charted and mapped by other organizations. I've allowed myself a little liberty in looking at economic issues because, again, as you mentioned just now, there are many different takes on what makes a good economic model. If you're part of a centralistic economy, somewhere like Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, you would be inclined to drive everything from the principle of communism. If you're in a democratic environment, you'll obviously allow a very liberal capital approach. The one thing I've noticed is it doesn't basically matter which of these structures you're under. Some people become incredibly rich and many people remain incredibly poor. And that's a generalization you can make across the planet. And so one of the conclusions that I've drawn from the book is that if we don't find a way of improving equality in society, wherever it is in the world, we'll never overcome some of the more fundamental disagreements between one party and another. So, for example, there's a long discussion about civil rights. It's not limited to any one country. But of course, from your perspective, you'll be very familiar with the issues that have been beleveling America over the last 4 or 5 generations. You know, they're there, they're part of each country, and it wouldn't matter which country we took, you'll have the same topics to concern
Yes,
yourself with.
every country. It's interesting traveling and talking to citizens of whatever country I'm in, even taxi drivers, and wow, there is a lot of inequality, lots of racism all over the world, civil issues. Absolutely.
Well,
I don't think there's one country that doesn't have that.
Yeah, one statistic I latched onto was presented by Oxfam to the Davos Economic Conference in 2020. They produced a very comprehensive economic analysis, and they drew attention to the fact that just over 2,000 billionaires, they're now about 3,000 billionaires worldwide, but at that time it was about 2,300 billionaires actually owned more money under their own control than 60% of the world population, 4.3 billion people. And that gives you some idea of how equality can grow. And I think one of my own conclusions would be at the end of the day, we're going to have to find a way of leveling up. And my own belief is strongly in support of private sector involvement. I've worked in the private sector most of my life. I've had to create my own income. Most of my colleagues have to do the same thing. We understand absolutely the importance of making profit. But when I see the scale at which now money is circulating in the world economy, which is not available to deal with some of these fundamental issues, because basically what the book is saying is with 2 to 3% of gross domestic product from the world economy, we'd solve all the problems. And that's a conclusion that has been recognized since Jeffrey Stern wrote his report back in 2008. And as he put it at the time, it's a small amount of money. I mean, politically, it would be very hard to get hold of it, but 2 to 3%.
You could say that again.
Solve the problem, and that's the issue. Because if I look at it from a UK perspective, we are sitting here desperately concerned about standard of living. I'm watching nightly on television stories of people who are literally going to food banks because they cannot support their children. And at the same time, I am sitting in the 6th richest economy in the world. When I'm out in Sierra Leone, where I spend a lot of my time working, 70 to 80% of the population are living in poverty. And they face the same problem. Kids are going to school without food. There's no available water. If the water is there, it's not safe. And I look at the scale and I can see every argument why in the UK or in America, we need to do leveling up. But then we have to find a way of doing leveling up between the more developed economies and the emerging economies. I can't even remember your question now, but I think I've been rabbiting on.
I don't know either, but this is a fascinating conversation. Now, you've already touched on a lot of the issues that the book covers. Are there any other issues that you would like to cover in this interview to give people a better idea of what they can expect from the book?
Okay, I think, as I said, there are 26 chapters, and each chapter inevitably is only 3 or 4 pages in length. And so it's no more than just a rapid summary of the state of conditions that exist. And effectively, you could read through a half of the book and you'd be pulling out the facts and the figures, which lead ultimately to the argument that if we were to tackle most of these global problems, it would cost of the order of 3% of the world economic turnover. And on the other hand, the economists who've done the analysis make it clear that that 3% would actually bring in return an 18% increase in global economic performance. It's the usual business. If you can improve the lives and conditions, as you said yourself earlier, if population grows, if you can provide jobs for young people, they will generate the income for their own country. So it's a matter of how do you stimulate the entire process. And because I've looked at these three key areas of environment, social, and economic conditions that we live under, the one area that isn't often covered in an environmental study, and it's something the World Bank has pressed for very strongly, is the institutional framework within which decisions are taken. Because it doesn't matter what sort of document you produce, if your decision makers are not going to take any notice or interest in it, it's a waste of time. So the last part of the book looks at global institutions. How do we reach our decisions? And I was really struck because I'd taken a timescale of 6 million years. Okay, 10,000 since we started to organize ourselves, but literally only 100 years since we found a way through the League of Nations of discussing how we conduct ourselves, for example, in war. 100 years is the only length of time in which those issues have been looked at. Europe has had 77 wars over 2,000 years. I mean, it's part and parcel of what we do. We fight each other. Mm-hmm. For 100 years at how do we try and resolve these issues, and the United Nations is literally only 76 years old. And if you look at the structure of the United Nations, it was pulled together at the end of the Second World War. Any analysis which has been done, and there's a lot of it, indicates that it's not really fit for purpose, the way in which the nations actually come together, discuss, argue. And that's partly down to the way that the original founding members, which were interestingly Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and America, have powers of veto. So the other 197 members of the United Nations very often can make whatever comments they like, but they have no prospect of taking action without that caucus agreeing. And as we recognize, that's something that simply doesn't happen very often. So looking at the way in which we operate, the book comes to basically one conclusion. Either we accept that every nation will continue to make its own decisions on whatever issue arises, and at the moment we're seeing a world in which each country is withdrawing to itself, or we accept that the role of an international body should be given more powers. And I've concluded that literally, since we have a United Nations, it would make greater sense to give it the powers to do what it needs to do. And so the primary recommendation is a reform of the United Nations. But added to that is an argument that what we really need is the current status of each individual country as a member, represented by its political leaders. But I would advocate for the creation of a world parliament, a people's parliament, in which you would draw two people from each of the 203 countries. That's roughly the same size of the US Senate and House of Representatives together, or the UK Parliament. And you would allow every single vote that goes through the political process to be tested by, rather, the public sector. And okay, it wouldn't alter things immediately. It would take a number of years. But I think if we could start to see how people, ordinary people, respond to some of our challenges, they would introduce a level of debate which is simply not there when, as you mentioned at the beginning, each country has to defend, or feels it has to defend, its own position. So you asked me what was special about the book, and I think it's that element of it which tries to take us from climate change, global warming, biodiversity, poverty, water scarcity, all these different factors, to argue that we need a framework at international level where we can deal with these things. So I'd give a lot more power to the World Health Organization, a lot more power to the International Court of Justice. At the moment, one of the statistics in the book is that the entire fund for the United Nations to deal with crisis situations in the world, and it's less than 1 year's profit from Walmart. And that is the reality of the situation. Private sector companies have more resources to play with than the entire United Nations. So I'm advocating a radical overhaul of the structure and a massive increase in funding, and then a whole series of recommendations which link to the need for global development funds. And a lot of these ideas are already there in the background with things like the climate change negotiations, where countries which are expecting to find themselves most hard hit, like the Maldives, the islands in the Pacific, which are going underwater. But most of Africa, most of South America are making the argument that the countries which have benefited most in the past need to do more to support those that are faced with the biggest impacts from these things. So there's some key issues, and whether anybody will respond to my request, I don't know, but I'm inviting anybody who reads the book to respond through our website, and if they do, we will then see if we can get some sort of a movement.
At the very least, it sparks an interesting conversation, even if people who read this disagree with you.
It contributes something to the current debate.
Exactly. We need to hear multiple perspectives from multiple people. So it's great that you are participating in this. It's incredibly important for the future. You've painted a very depressing vision of the future, but do you see any evidence of change for the better?
One of my worries is that we seem to be very poor at identifying what it is that we as human beings want out of life. If you talk with the major religions, they will give you the advice that even though conditions here are as harsh and as bad as they are, the life in the hereafter will be wonderful. It doesn't matter whether you're talking to somebody with an Islamic faith or a Christian faith or a Hindu faith, it's what comes in the world after, which is basically writing off what we have at the moment. And it is a fact that the conditions, I think, will get worse on the planet before they get better. On the other hand, the book spells out that there are a whole range of areas in which human endeavor, technological advance, is making massive change. So we're getting change in medicine, we're getting change in artificial intelligence, in energy supply. So all of those elements are picked out as positives where we are going to see change. But in a section which is called Faith and Aesthetics, the question is, but what sort of world do we really want to live in? Many people are going to find themselves living in cities, for example. The trends over the next 50 years will take us from where we are now, which is roughly 50% of the world lives in a rural area and 50% in a town or a village or a city. Within 50 years, it's likely that 85% of the world will live in urban areas.
Are you saying that these rural areas will turn more urban, or are these rural people going to move to the city?
These are people moving into the cities. So what we're seeing is the growth of megacities, being that the definition is more than 10 million people. And again, these are the projections, and there's every reason to imagine that they will follow. But the question that isn't clearly addressed is, how are you going to continue to provide water, food, for a population that is no longer living on the land, no longer relying on its own resources? Lagos is projected to be the largest city in the world with 90 million people in it by 2100. Where on earth are you going to get enough food? How is the transport system going to operate to bring water, food, sanitation, power into cities of this size? So there's a massive exercise needed, and I have no idea, for example, where you live, apart from the fact that it's Florida, and that's a wonderful part of the world. But Florida faces its challenges with rising sea level. So if you're living in some parts of Florida Keys, in 40 years' time, you'll no longer be living there. It's a simple fact of life. So, okay, the question is it all pessimistic or is it optimistic? I'm pretty certain that human beings are amazingly adaptable. And providing we avoid fundamental crises like the onset of a nuclear war, ultimately we will find a way of dealing with things. But we'll do it in a very messy and cumbersome way, and we'll learn more from mistakes than from logical forward planning. And that's what comes of being a planner. You just get used to the idea of we shouldn't just let the future determine itself. We as human beings know that we want to live in a clean, healthy environment. We want our kids to be able to go to school safely. We want them to have areas to play. We want sports. We're a very sociable species. And basically, we get on very well together when we're in our family groups, our community groups. It's only when we get ourselves involved in these sort of tensions between one political party and another, or one country and another, that everything goes pear-shaped. So I'm looking for some sort of coming together of a plan for the future. And that's basically why the book's called Planning for a Better, Greener Future.
Well, another optimistic note that I would like to make is, do you remember early into COVID when the world shut down and there were places that normally don't have any wildlife, there's no creatures in the water, and as soon as people stopped going out, which I'm not saying we should shut down the entire world, but it was fascinating how quickly these animals and fish came back to their natural environment when humans were out of the way. And to me, like I said, I don't think we should shut everything down and get people out of the way. However, it is beautiful to see how quickly things can return back to normal if we find a solution. There's got to be a way to where we could allow humans to live our normal lives while also protecting the environment.
So I have a very specific example, which is quoted in the book, because part of my career involved working on land reclamation after major mineral works. And there are two locations in the north of England where, in my lifetime, the areas have been mined for coal and for sand and gravel. The land has been restored to an agreed plan. And in both cases, those sites are now deemed to be sites of special scientific interest. That's the UK definition of a nature reserve, somewhere where the range of animals and plants that are found within it are special. And that's within areas that were mined literally 30 years ago. So I absolutely agree with you. Nature is very resilient. And I actually think if I wasn't so concerned about being a human being, that if we weren't on the planet, nature would get on with itself extraordinarily well. And it's largely our interventions that cause the problems. But on the other hand, we also have a capacity, as has recently been announced, where the great blue whale, the largest living animal on the planet, is coming back in areas where it was previously fished out. So yes, it's absolutely possible to go into the future in a positive way. But the pointers at the moment are not all focused in that direction.
Do you offer any solutions to the challenges, or is this just a litany of disasters?
Well, there are a whole series of specific recommendations at the back of the book. But I have to say they all do depend on one thing, and that is some form of agreement on international governance, so that when difficulties, crises arise, we have a more considered response to it. So I've talked a lot about environment, a lot about social conditions, but for example, at the moment, there's a lot of issues over world trade. There's a lot of interest in countries wanting, on the one hand, to make more products for themselves, to sell more to themselves, in other words, to exclude themselves from global trade. But we are, like it or not, now linked globally in every single aspect, whether it's environment, climate change, or trading. And so I think it's crucial that we have better mechanisms and mechanisms that are more open and transparent to the public. Well, the World Trade Organization does its job, the World Health Organization does its job. And actually, COVID did demonstrate that when necessary, some key experts from World Health Organization came out. And as you were saying, that we were all being persuaded to stay at home, but they, for the first time, were becoming public faces, public images. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to see a lot more of the way that decision making is taken out in the public arena. And that, I think, is the fundamental recommendation in the book. So yeah, it's not all by any means gloom and doom.
Good. That's good to hear. I like knowing that there's some hope for a better future. Now, I have a personal question for you. So, I was speaking with a man in Germany recently who was about your age, and he said that when he was young, the weather was extremely different. He said that there used to be a meter of snow all winter on the ground, that it was a lot colder. Have you personally experienced that in your life?
Oh, absolutely. I could mirror his examples because I've always had this interest in environment. I wanted to find out how Eskimos lived, and so the Inuit, and I regularly built in the north of England igloos. I learned how to make ice blocks, and I constructed complete igloos. That is impossible. It hasn't been possible for 20 years. If I go to my other experience of working in Africa over 20 years, I've seen massive changes in the drought conditions just below the Sahara in the Sahel. So yeah, the straightforward answer is I can chart, as I think most of us are beginning to do. We can all think back to childhood and think, yeah, this is how things have changed.
Well, this was a great conversation. I think our viewers will get a lot out of it, and it definitely sparks a lot of thinking and conversation. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. What is the best place for people who are interested in purchasing the book or learning more information about you and your work? What's the best place to do so?
Okay. I'm actually in the hands of some marketing experts who probably have a better idea than I do of what's going to happen next. But the book itself will be out on Amazon Books. It's due to be released as an ebook, as a paperback, and I'm very much hoping that there will be an audio version of the book as well, which I'm hoping to read myself.
Please, you have a wonderful voice.
That'll be in about 2 days' time. By the weekend, it will be out on Amazon Books. And if anybody wants to look up planninggreenfutures.org, that's our website, and so there'll be a lot more information on that. And I'd like to end this interview from my side by saying thank you very much indeed for engaging conversation. I wish in a way this process could be the other way around. There's an awful lot of what you were hinting at in the background, whether it's Germany or whether it's some of my political statements. Well, I'd love to have heard what your real views are on some of these things. So maybe next time we could interview you the other way around.
Oh gosh, I like taking it all in. And then whenever I'm having a conversation with someone, I think, oh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And then I hear the opposite side and think, oh, that makes a lot of sense too. So I like interviewing people, but I don't usually share my own perspective because there's just so much information out there, and I'm definitely not an expert on the topic.
Well, I can say this is the first time I've ever attempted to do it. I mean, I'm used as, not like an interviewer, but as a consultant, I'm used to providing facts and figures to other people to make their arguments. It's something different to being asked to do it for yourself. So there we are.
Wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I've enjoyed it too.
All the best.
Thank you now. Bye.